Hello everybody, and welcome to another LIDNUG user groups free sessions that we are holding every month. This month, again in association with DevelopMentor, we are presenting Maurice de BeijerLIDNUG doing Practical HTML5. So just before I hand it over to Maurice, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping slides. First and foremost, as always, thank you very much to all of our sponsors, Orcrypt, Telerik, Inner Workings, Poolside, Ventilate, and Syncfusion for all of your support. It is truly appreciated, and without all of your support, we really couldn't do what we are doing. If you want to get hold of us, you can always email us on info@lidnug.org. You catch us on the social at twitter.com/lidnug or facebook.com/lidnug. And all of our sessions are also uploaded to our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/lidnug. Our website, which is still undergoing a few changes and design, you can find at bit.ly/lidnug. Upcoming events for November, we have Scott Guthrie coming back for the 17th time, doing his open Q&A. That's pretty much a 90-minute session where Scott Guthrie literally answers any question that comes in. I don't think I've ever seen him not answer a specific question yet. And we will have Maurice back again on the 14th of November, doing a tour of AngularJS. Just introducing Maurice here. This is not his first event. This is his second event. He's a teacher at DevelopMentor. He also has a blog. It's at msmvps.com/blog/theproblemsolver. He's a podcaster and a presenter and an independent software consultant. And he's also doing an awful lot of these for us. Last but not least, we have the attendee geography today. Actually, we see there's two from Australia this time. Quite a good spread around the world, so welcome everybody. And I am going to hand over to Maurice. Maurice, thank you very much for coming back again for your second session, in a string of many actually.
Okay, thank you. Let me start by sharing my screen, so everyone should be able to see my screen. So welcome to this session on Practical HTML5. So I'm going to skip the Who Am I slides. I think we just covered that part. No need to repeat it. So instead, let's go straight away to the slide about what we're going to cover. Basically all the things about HTML5 which you can actually use. Now I'm using HTML5 in the umbrella term here. Things like IndexedDB, which we'll be looking at, are technically speaking not really HTML5 items. They're their own standards, and the HTML5 standards is much more limited than that. So I'm using it in the umbrella term, and all the new stuff going on with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the stuff we can benefit from. All the demos I've got are actually online on Azure. If you click this link, let's go back here, bit.ly/lph5, that's LIDNUG Practical HTML5, at least shortened to a reasonable length. You get to this Azure website, and that's got all the demos I'll be covering this session. Additionally, the slides and the source code from everything, most of it's client-side, so already available here, but I'll be sharing that in a little better way, including the small server-side part that's there. So the things we're going to look at. First of all, we're going to take a quick look at how you can determine what you can actually use and what's not so usable, and about using polyfills, which are basically faking an HTML5 API using something which isn't strictly speaking there by its nature, like an older browser. We're going to take a look at some of the new HTML5 elements, things like video elements, time element, different input elements you've got, the semantic markup, etc. We're going to take a look at WebSockets. We're not actually going to take a look at data binding and templating. That's something I accidentally left in, but I dropped that because of lack of time, so sorry about that. We're going to take a look at WebSockets and how we can use those in our application in a practical cross-browser way so they actually work. We're going to take a look at drag-drop, two different things. First of all, dragging things from outside of the browser into the browser, like files, and reacting to that and reading those files, etc. And additionally, we'll be taking a look at drag-drop inside of the browser, and then specifically for touch devices, because drag-drop is easy enough, and especially with touch devices, it's very popular. But in the case of, say, jQuery, which I'm going to use there, you need to do a little more than just the standard work in order to get it working. Then we're going to take a look at working with graphical elements, specifically the Canvas and SVG, the two graphical systems you can use to manipulate images inside of the browser, and take a look at some practical libraries around that. And the last thing we're going to do is storing data in the browser using a couple of different mechanisms like IndexedDB, and seeing how we can use a couple of libraries to make that easier. But first, some practical things to get started with. The first site I pretty much use whenever I plan something is caniuse.com. Caniuse basically has a huge list of all sorts of HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript features, and it will tell you how they're supported. So suppose I want to take a look at, say, color input type. It shows me a little table here. This one's pretty much all red. Most of the things are red, so that basically tells us it's not very well supported. Right here at the top, it actually says that the global support is about 34% of browsers on the internet. I don't put too much value on this percentage. It's like different sites have different audiences, and they've got different preferences for browsers. So the percentage will vary, but it's a pretty good indication. If you see something like 90 or 95% there, you can be pretty sure that almost everyone can use that feature, and something like that, 34%, you're pretty sure that most people won't be able to. And in fact, if we look here, it's just Chrome, Opera, and the BlackBerry browser which support it. Well, that tells you pretty much anytime you want to use this and you're not specifically targeting Chrome or Opera, it's pretty much a no-go. If you look at other stuff, like let's take IndexedDB, you see that support is slightly better. They claim 57%. It's supported in modern versions of IE, Firefox, Chrome, etc., Opera. Interestingly, not in Safari. Chrome and Safari are both WebKit-based browsers. Presumably this is part of WebKit, but Safari doesn't support it. That could be because they're using an older version of WebKit, although given that Chrome has supported this for quite some time, it's more likely that it just turned this off for some reason. Sometimes political, sometimes technical. It's kind of hard to say. In yet other cases, like let's take local storage, you see it's mostly green. Local storage, it's pretty much green except for Opera Mini, which over here is red, but other than that it's green, and it says, well, it's supported for over 90% of the browsers. So you can be pretty much guaranteed that most people will support it. It turns out that if we click this, we can see all versions. You can see that IE7 and before don't support it, so pretty old versions of IE don't support this, but IE7 isn't that commonly used anymore, so it's pretty good to go. So that's one website I use a lot. So suppose we want to use something, let's say we want to use Canvas. And we can see it's supported pretty well, 80%, but not on IE8. And you do have to support IE8 on your application because there are still quite a few users using IE8, especially in the enterprise world. Well, there are a couple of sites to go to. First of all, you can go to HTML5 please, which is similar to Can I Use. It basically lists things and gives you some advice here from whether it's usable or you should avoid it, like with box reflection in this case, one of the CSS things. And over here they'll have canvas and they'll have this list of recommended polyfills. 2 Flash Canvas and Explorer Canvas, which are the ones they recommend as pretty good ways to get Canvas working in browsers that don't natively support it. As you can imagine, the first one, Flash Canvas, is implemented using Flash, so it has a requirement of Flash. The second one, Explorer Canvas, is actually based on pure JavaScript, so it should work without any plugin whatsoever. As long as JavaScript is enabled, it should just work. The other site I use is an HTML5 polyfill list made by the Modernizer people. Modernizer is basically a library where you can do feature detection, so you could check at runtime whether Canvas or one of the other features is supported. And they've got basically lists here. And you can see over here that they've also got a list of polyfills for Canvas, including Flash Canvas and Explorer Canvas. That's actually this one, EX Canvas. But they've got some other ones as well, like SL Canvas, which uses Silverlight instead of Flash. Same dependency on the plugin, but a different plugin. And I'm not sure how the others work, but couple more options to check. So those are nice, but there is one big issue. As soon as you start faking an HTML5 API using JavaScript, you can expect it to be slower than the original feature implemented in, well, whatever they've used to implement that browser. Probably C++. Then it's often needed for older browsers, and specifically older versions of IE tend to run JavaScript a lot slower than modern ones. Not sure of the exact figure, but rule of the thumb, between version 8 and 9 there was about a 10-fold increase in speed in JavaScript, so between IE8 and IE9. And again, between IE7 and IE8 there was something like similar. So if you have to fall back to JavaScript to polyfill something on an old version of IE which runs JavaScript slow, you can't really do a lot of complex stuff with it. So make sure to test it in those browsers. Make sure that the speed is acceptable. Don't just go into IE 10 or 9. Let's see, I've got, which version of IE do I have? I believe 10. Let's double check. Yes, 10. If you go to Developer Tools, why is nothing happening here? There it is. I should be able to go to F12 Developer Tools, but for some reason it's disabled. Let's close this browser and start it again. It is not a very happy browser now. But now I can press F12. And one of the things you see here at the bottom is browser modes and documents modes. Well, a lot of your older IE testing you can do here by selecting this and saying, okay, switch to IE7 and IE7 standards mode. And now this browser behaves like IE7. That's also true for standard things available in JavaScript, but it's not true for JavaScript to run speed. So even though I've set this to browser mode IE7, document mode IE7 standards, it will still run JavaScript at the native IE10 speed. So be aware of that. It does most things IE7-like, but not everything. JavaScript, one of them. So you really have to install a virtual machine and run IE7 through a virtual machine and get a pretty good estimate of the actual speed there. Of course, if you use something like Flash Canvas or one of those other Flash-based polyfills to get newer functionality in older browsers, you won't have that same problem, but of course you do have a dependency on Flash being installed there. And I've actually in some cases just tried to use the native API. If that wasn't available, tried if I could fall back to Flash Canvas, and if that wasn't available, fall back to EX Canvas. I get the fastest, best option available. Native is best. If that doesn't work, I'll take the Flash option. But if that isn't available, at least I've got something. It's slow, it's limited, but it will work. Just remember to use HTML5, please, and can I use those two sites to check whether your target audience will actually support it. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some real HTML5 things, because this is actually part of the HTML5 specification, the new semantic elements. Basically what the standardization committee has done is look at a lot of usage of elements on public websites, and they came to the conclusion that part of the layout is pretty common. Almost every public-facing site has some kind of header, has some kind of footer, has some kind of navigation block, and has one or more sections with articles in there, and has some additional information like advertisements or banners or things like that, which are somewhat less important. And it turned out that most of these use pretty standard names. Like here in the sheet we see a header element and a footer element. It turned out that most web designers actually used a div ID header, div ID footer, and div with class article, div class section, and div class a site, etc. Most of these tended to be divs. So they said, well, everything on the web being divs is not very informative, so let's standardize these elements so we can do this with it, at least give them a standard form of layout, and do some more stuff with it. Like with an article element, you can put a time element in there, and if you include the pub dates attribute, that time element actually means it's the date time when that specific article was published. So there are useful relations between different elements as a result of this. Now whether this buys you a lot or not is still very much up for discussion. Support's pretty good though. According to Can I Use, it's almost 82%, and all modern browsers support this. IE8 is probably the most commonly used browser that doesn't support it. And it turns out that polyfilling these new elements is really easy. There are a couple of different ways you can do it. Modernizer will do it for you if you include it. Otherwise, there is a library called HTML5 Shiv, which will do it just as well. It turns out that polyfilling these is really simple. It's just before you use any of them, if you create them in the browser and you specify some standard styles, most of these are actually block level elements, so you have to style them as block level elements, then they will just work. So that's pretty easy to do and pretty well supported. However, why? Well, originally the story was a lot about searchability and accessibility, and it's like from, okay, if Google understands what a navigation section is and what an about section is, etc., it can make more sense of your website and can do a better job with indexing it, and you basically get better indexability. So search engine optimization. The other argument was accessibility. People who are badly sighted, etc., using screen readers and other aids like that, those aids would be able to see from, okay, this is a navigation block, so they know the context of links, what they're supposed to do, etc. It turns out that neither is really the case. According to the story, most of these were originally just divs with a specific ID or class name. And if Google realized that, I'm sure they'll use that for their indexing engine, and it's really not going to bias a lot over that. For accessibility, there are the area attributes, which are specifically meant for that. And if they're not present, I'm sure those accessibility aids like screen readers will do a similar job to search engines. Look for these kind of element names, but if not, just use class names, etc. So it doesn't really buy you a lot. That said, if I create a new public-facing website, I will use these new elements, but it's kind of like I'm not going to go in with older websites and fix it, change those elements from div to the newer elements. It doesn't buy me a lot there. It's more like in the future it might buy me more, so I will use them, but not such a big deal yet. Another thing they added is a lot of different input types. Like previously we had input type text and input type file and a couple of others. But for almost all inputs, you would tend to use an input type text. It's pretty much if you wanted an email, a date, a number, you would just use an input type text and be done with it. So with HTML5 they invented a whole range of new HTML5 input elements, and some of the common ones, more likely ones to use, are up on the screen here, like input type email, where it understands that whatever you put in there is supposed to be an email, or a number, or a URL, date, time, etc. Now, sorry, I was distracted by a message at the bottom. Now, with the current desktop browsers, there is some support for this, but it isn't all that good, and it turns out that most actually fall back to input type text. So if the type is something they don't understand, they'll just render an input type text and be done with it. Let's actually go back to my demo for a moment. I've got a link here with all the input elements, and basically you can see that I'm in Chrome here. Chrome supports most of these. And if I go to IE, it's not nearly as many. You see here a datetime element, I can just start entering A's, etc. An email element, it actually shows up an error. I've got some styling in here which uses the :invalid pseudo style. Let's actually just view the source in here. Let's zoom in a bit. I used the input :invalid pseudo style to turn the background to red if the element's actually invalid. So you see email is understood and A is an invalid email address, but A is considered a valid email address. And a number A is also valid because it doesn't understand numbers. Chrome is a little better. I was typing the A character there, nothing much happens, but if I start, and I think there it is. It seems I also didn't have focus because I can type A's, but it warns me about it being invalid. But I can also type numbers and then it's valid. And I've got these little spinners where I can actually go up and down through numbers. Not sure if I wanted to type in a large number or whether those spinners are actually useful. Same with email. A is invalid, but A at A is already valid. Now, I'm not sure who I'm going to reach if I send an email to a@a, but I'm pretty sure it's going to get lost and not routed anywhere. So probably a little relaxed on entering a valid email address. It's the same with phone numbers, etc. Search doesn't do any validation, just gives you a slightly different style. URL is valid, but http://a is already valid, although I'm pretty sure that won't go anywhere either. There's some other ones which are reasonably useful, like a date time. You can actually select a date, and using spinners you can actually change individual values. Looks pretty reasonable. Got a little date picker pop up. Select today or go through it. The problem with these are though that you can't really style them. It's the US style date, so month, day, year. And I live in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands it's day, month, year, so it's not formatted the way I would expect. And I'm running from the Netherlands on a Dutch PC with Dutch locale, so I really would have liked this to show up using the Dutch formatting. Same is true for a date time with local. I actually have to specify some time here before it's valid. Or there is one for just time. One for a month. I suppose that's relatively useful. Another one for week numbers. Basically you select a week number. Again, this is one which would need severe customization because there is no global standard for a week number. First of all, week 1 is different from region to region. It's the first week of the whole year, or the first week with 4 days, or the week containing January 1st. So there is a big difference there which you can't influence. The other thing is weeks. You can see over here that the selected week looks a bit weird. Well, in the Netherlands, our week starts on Monday and ends on Sunday, but in the US it starts on Sunday and ends on Saturday. So the week thing starts with Sunday and ends with Saturday, US style, but the selection is what I would have expected in the Netherlands. So looks kind of weird. Not perfect. They certainly need some work on that. However, on mobile devices, things are different. On desktop devices, if I'm really targeting only desktop browsers, I would pretty much forego using these. But if I'm targeting mobile devices, it's a lot better. If you target, say, an Android or an iPhone and you put in an input type number, the soft keyboard which pops up will actually change and will only display numbers. It's the same with an email. It will show you the @ sign and .com, .net, etc. Those abbreviations for the top level domain. The same with a date. So most of these actually start making sense because the keyboard adapts to the kind of input which gets focused. So that's where they're pretty useful. Other than that, it's still somewhat weak. Some other HTML5 elements which have been added, which are pretty useful. Things like video and audio for displaying video and audio. They're still somewhat limited, no DRM, limited in their capabilities of which video formats, audio formats they support, although the H.264 format has pretty much won on the video front, so expect that to become supported all over the place. Meter progress, they're both used to show some kind of numerical value. Progress is like 50% or a meter is some kind of value using a graphical bar. And they've got pretty good fallbacks because if you put something inside of them, a browser that doesn't understand meter or progress with their attributes will just show the content. So you could do something like progress with a value of 50 and then put inside 50%. Older browser will show you 50%, newer browsers will show you the graphical progress being 50%. Timing is another one which actually turns out to be relatively useful. The problem with displaying times on the internet is that on the server you've got no clue about the time zone of the client. Let me actually show you a little page here. I've got local time. This is running on Windows Azure, and I'm basically printing out a couple of values. And I'm basically over here saying from the current time on the server is 5:32 p.m. The current time in UTC, that's also on the server, is 5:32 p.m. That's because of Windows Azure servers always run in UTC, so that's always going to be the same. And the current time in my browser is 7:32, which is correct because we're 2 hours ahead of UTC in the summertime. In the wintertime, just 1. But I couldn't do that on the server. Basically, the server has no way of knowing what time zone I'm located. And that's where using the time element actually comes in. Let me show you the source for this page. So the first elements were pretty simple. Basically, I just printed out datetime.now to long time string, and the same with UTC. The third value, however, I did something different. I basically said, does this work? Yeah, I can just zoom in. I basically created the time element and printed out the UTC datetime at the datetime attribute and specified a data format. This second part, data format, is custom. The first part, the datetime attribute, is a standard property of the time element. Basically, with data format, I'm adding my own stuff. And as you can see a little further down, let me zoom in here, there is no actual content there. Now, by default, the time element doesn't do anything. It doesn't show up. But I've added a little script here, right at the bottom, which basically says, a bit of jQuery code, select all time elements which have a date-format attribute, look through all of them, select them, extract the datetime from it, and format that using whatever was specified in the data-format attribute. So I'm using moment.js here, which makes it real easy to format things. Basically, you can just specify a format string and format it. You could do this equally well without moment.js. Just new up a datetime with UTC format. It will convert it to the local datetime, and you can start parsing it, etc. So this works perfectly well, including for other dates, like I've included January 1st noon and July 1st. So January, it's winter time in the Netherlands, so we're 1 hour off from UTC, and July 1st, it's summertime, so we're 2 hours off. All of this is recognized. So that's a little trick on how to get around the fact that your server doesn't know your browser's time zone. Just do it on the client, and the time element is the perfect companion for that. So the next thing to look at is WebSockets. WebSockets basically let you connect from the server to the browser and vice versa using a low-level socket connection. So why is that useful? Well, there are lots of cases where you've got information on the server which you want to push to client applications. Now, the typical example, including the example I've coded up, is a chat application, but it's used for lots of places. Anytime you've got real-time updates, like you might have article data in a warehouse application with inventory, so every time something is brought in or sold, your inventory changes. Well, if those updates are important, you can push them out using WebSockets to all the connected browsers so they immediately see it. They don't have to go and refresh. Because the old way of doing this is basically just refreshing the browser, either the complete page, just hit F5 or use a meta refresh tag, or use an AJAX call with a set interval to periodically do that request. But of course that creates a lot of load on the server, having to rebuild the complete page, etc., even though there might not be any changes at all. Well, WebSockets will basically let you push out the change whenever it occurs, as soon as it occurs, so updates are immediate. And that by itself would work really well, except for a few problems. WebSockets are basically new standards. Let me pull up a demo page containing some WebSockets. I've got a little chat page. And the first thing to note here is I need to put WebSocket object to create a connection, but it actually uses the WS scheme. So it doesn't use HTTP or HTTPS, it uses WS, which is a network scheme which piggybacks on top of HTTP, but it's different. So not every server, not every router or proxy or firewall might understand this, and some of those might just say, well, I don't really understand this, it could be some kind of system trying to hack us, so let's block it. It's going over port 80, so it should be HTTP, but it isn't. Let's just prevent it from going through. The other thing is your server actually needs to support this. Now, if I try to run this page, let's open it in the browser. It's going to say, oops, unable to connect to WebSocket. If I copy this to my laptop and run it there, it will work just fine, no problem. So what's causing this difference? I'm running this on Windows 7. Windows 7 is both my client and my server, but it's about the server part here. Doesn't support WebSockets. It's basically not going to work ever. My laptop runs Windows 8. It is a supported feature on Windows 8. It's something you have to turn on. It's not turned on by default, but you can turn it on. And then it's actually supported by IIS and you can use it. So I've got server dependencies here. And in this case, it's just not going to work. If I go to the online version on Azure, and I click on WebSockets, I get the same problem. Personally, I was under the impression that Azure supported WebSockets, but apparently this doesn't work. Because on my laptop with Windows 8 it certainly works, so I know it's not a coding problem. So the capability is really nice, but unfortunately it doesn't work. So if we want this capability and it doesn't work as is, can we get something else? Here's actually a little support. So it turns out that browser-wise it's actually relatively well supported. It's just the fact that this doesn't say anything about the server and all the intermediate infrastructure for that matter. So it turns out the ASP.NET team has created another product called SignalR, which is basically the same conceptual thing as WebSockets. Actually, that's not completely true. It is a little higher level, but it will use WebSockets as the communication protocol if available. But if that isn't available, it will fall back to other mechanisms like server-sent events or AJAX long polling or forever frame. So depending on what's available between the client and the server, it will use the best possible combination. The code's pretty similar. Over here you could see, just ignore this for a moment, that's just to get a unique ID. But basically with new WebSockets we'd start listening for messages being received, and whenever we want to send one we can just use the WS, so the WebSocket object.send, to send whatever we want. The SignalR version does pretty much the same thing. In this case, we start a connection hub. Grab a reference to the hub, and then we can, over here, do send to send a message. And in this case, I'm using broadcast from the server to send something from the server to the client. So let's actually make sure this works. View in browser. And let's open this in the second browser. And if the first sends a message, you see it arrives in the second. There, if I can type from IE10, and you see Chrome reaches that just fine. And this will also work on the internet. If I go to the SignalR demo, and let's do that over here as well. And in fact, all of you who are online have this demo page open, could start chatting. It's not restricted to just my browsers. Anyone who goes to this URL could join in the chat. So there's someone joining in with thanks. So that's pretty awesome. So like I said, the programming model on the clients is pretty similar. The chat page included a bit of error handling here, and in order to know who sent a message, I'm generating a unique ID here. But other than that, the code's pretty similar, pretty straightforward. And of course, both need a server-side part. In the case of WebSockets, I've got this WebSocket handler, which basically just sends messages back to the client and registers itself in open and removes itself on a close. And there is a little handler involved, in here, which basically accepts a WebSocket request and upgrades to WebSockets. So not a lot of code, but with SignalR it's even less. This is all the server-side code I need. Basically, I create a class deriving from hub. Hub is the SignalR base class from any server-side hub. In this case, I've called it chat hub. Any public method here is callable by a client. And if I want to send something to connected clients, basically there is a clients object here. And doing that, I can do one of a number of things, like we can do clients.all, which would send it to every client. Clients. What is it? Caller, which would just send it to the one who originated this incoming request. We can create groups. I can do it to other people in a specific group, so it doesn't go back to the sender, but only to others. In this case, I basically said, okay, broadcast the received message to all other connected clients, so not the original originator, but all others, and they receive it, which was exactly what was happening right here. So that's really simple. And of course, it works. Like on my laptop, which has Windows 8, as I mentioned before, if I did this, it would actually connect up using WebSockets and use WebSockets as the transport protocol. In IE, I'm not quite sure what it's using, but I believe it's using Forever Frame. Let's actually check for a moment, because if we start capturing here, we can see, you see a SignalR negotiate, and it's basically, okay, the transport it's using is long polling. So basically you see a little negotiation going on from, okay, what can we use, and it decides to use long polling. And let's take a look what Firefox uses. So you see the same negotiate, but in this case it's using server-sent events. So different browser clients, different capabilities, it will use a different transport. But it will try to use the best one possible, which is WebSockets, if that's available. Of course, there is a little more to SignalR. I said it's a little higher level. It's not just a replacement for WebSockets, because WebSockets pure has some more problems. It's really just a low-level socket connection between the browser and the server. And if you're doing any form of scale-out, you're getting a lot of loads. You have to scale out your server. It's basically, okay, now a message was sent through WebSockets is received on one server. It has to notify the other servers. It's perfectly possible to do that, but you have to write the code to do that. SignalR 1.1 has scale-out scenarios built in, so you can create a backplane and just plug a couple of standard classes in, and it will use one of a number of possible things like Redis or SQL Server or Azure Service Bus to send the message from one server to all the others. Another problem with plain WebSockets is that your connection might be dropped briefly and then re-established. Well, how do you know you've not missed any messages? If you're doing some financial application, like a trading application, and a stock suddenly drops in price by a large margin, you don't want to drop that message. You want to be sure that every trader sees that. With WebSockets that's possible, but it's low level. You basically have to track missing messages and make sure you get all of them. In the case of SignalR, it will do that for you, and it will put them in a queue, and as long as the drop isn't too long, like if connection is dropped for an hour, then you'll miss messages. But if it's just dropped for a second or so and then re-established automatically, it will automatically send the messages which are still queued up, so you don't get to miss anything. So there are lots of benefits to using SignalR over something like plain WebSockets. But of course, SignalR is ASP.NET and it requires a server-side component. And if you're not using ASP.NET, well, just starting to use it because of SignalR might not be what you want. In that case, there are other alternatives, like for instance, if you're using Node.js, there is a library called socket.io, which has similar capabilities to SignalR. It actually has even more fallbacks in place than SignalR, and pretty similar capabilities other than that. So I would use that instead of raw WebSockets. So the next thing to look at is drag and drop. Basically, drag and drop can make applications a lot easier. Doing drag and drop in the browser wasn't very hard. Everyone, or pretty much everyone who's done any web development has used jQuery and jQuery UI. Well, drag and drop is built into jQuery UI, so you could just very easily, with very few lines of code, start dragging elements around in the browser. But with HTML5, they've embedded that as a native part in the browser. And what's more, they've actually enabled the scenario where you can drop something from outside the browser into the browser and react on it. For instance, files from the file system. So let's do a quick demo before we get into the code. I've got a drag drop images here, and let's show this in the browser. And we've got this nice and green, bright green bar at the top which says drop files here. It's actually a little particular about what kind of files it wants images. So we can just grab a few images, and let's first show you the default. This is what a browser usually does if you draw it. Basically, the URL here changes and you get to see that specific image in the browser. However, if I drop it on this green bar, you see it doesn't change the URL, it actually reads the file and drops it in. And not just a single, I can put in a whole set of files. And you see all the files appear. So what does it take to do this? Surprisingly little. Drop images. I bind to the drag over event to prevent the default behavior from the browser. That's showing the complete file. The same with the drop, prevent the default. And then basically, there is a data transfer object, which has a files collection. And using that files collection, I can basically start reading those files. Here I've got another HTML5 feature, a file reader, which will actually let me read this file from disk. So basically, I read this file in using a read as data URL. So I don't actually link to the file on disk. I get a copy as a data URL. And when that's done, I basically create an image element, set the source and a couple of other attributes on it, and append it to a list of images. So if we look on here and we inspect this element, let's see if we can make this a little more visible. You can see in here the first part of that data URL. The whole URL is a lot longer. It's basically a JPEG image base 64 encoded, so you can imagine that the base 64 encoding of this image is quite a bit longer. But all of that is basically just stuffed in the browser and it will run. Of course, I could have done other things. I could have done an AJAX post and uploaded this to the server or anything else I wanted to. So pretty simple to use. I've got one little caveat here, IE, and that's, if I'm not mistaken, IE9 and below, or at least IE9 supports drag and drop, but it doesn't support files. You can use the data transfer object, set data on there, do other stuff, but you can't drag files. Let's quickly check exactly which version. Drag drop. So yeah, IE8 and 9 have partial support for this. They do support drag drop, but not the file elements. And IE10 and above supports the file element. Other than that, it's pretty good support. No support on iOS, but then you same with the Android and BlackBerry browser. But then you don't have an Explorer there to drag files into your browser, so that part isn't a big issue. And native drag and drop inside of the browser is easily done using something like jQuery UI. So a nice capability. It's something that I wouldn't rely on. I will always still have something like a button when select files and read them that way, upload them that way, whatever I want to do with them. Because not every user likes drag and drop or is comfortable with it. It does require a bit more mousing capabilities, but it's a real nice addition. It's like with Gmail. If you want to upload a file, you can click a button, select the file, or you can drag the file in and drop it on your email and it will automatically be uploaded and attached. So the other thing is, let's actually go back to the slides for a moment, is using tablets and other touch devices. Drag and drop using jQuery UI works pretty well on a desktop computer, but it turns out that they don't actually react to touch events. They actually use the mouse events for all their drag and drop. So mouse move, mouse down, mouse up, etc. And if you're using an iPad, it turns out they fire drag events and drag start, drag end, drag move, etc. and not the mouse events. So if you do drag and drop using jQuery UI by itself, it just won't work. I've got a little demo here, using touch. Let's run it for a moment. Basically this will drag around. Now I'm on a desktop computer, I don't have touch, so I can't really demonstrate the fact that this wouldn't work with just a touch screen, but trust me, it wouldn't. If I did the default thing. Let's open this. Let's first take a quick look. Basically I'm using jQuery UI here, making the small square draggable, and the big square I'm making droppable, and whenever I drop I say dropped. Well, that's not even supposed to be here. That's left over from another demo. Let's get rid of that. So, way too much code which wasn't necessary. That's in another demo where I actually did things a bit more dynamic. Basically, by adding this library, jQuery UI Touch Punch, it starts checking for for touch events and converts those to the associated mouse events. So if you actually visit this page, where is this page on the internet using an iPad, it will drag around just fine. That takes care of iPads and Androids, and etc. Unfortunately, it doesn't take care of Windows 8. For Windows 8, we need to do one more thing. We basically have to add this style, MS Touch Action None. With Windows 8 and Internet Explorer there, Microsoft basically said, okay, we know what touch action should do and will do the default thing for it, which means that the touch events don't actually fire. By adding this MS Touch Action None, you're basically saying, okay, don't do any of the default action, let me decide what to do, and in that case you get the events and you can respond to it. So that's needed for IE 10 and 11 on Windows 8 with touch. The jQuery UI Touch Punch is required for iPads, Androids, and those kind of devices. With those two combined, this will just work without any problem. So how well is drag and drop supported? Well, jQuery drag and drop is supported in all browsers where jQuery UI runs, so that's pretty much everything IE 6 and above. Drag and drop from the HTML5 perspective is in somewhat more modern browsers, and like I mentioned before, IE 8 and 9 don't support dropping files, but they do support the HTML5 style. Although quite frankly, if I don't actually need to drop anything from outside the browser, I'll just use the jQuery UI drag and drop because it's very easy to program with, and with the little two additions I just demoed, it works fine on iPads and similar devices. So here's the two additions I just did. So graphics. There are a couple of different options which have been added to IE5 to do graphical work inside the browsers. So traditionally we used to do all graphics on the server, basically create images there and then download those to the client and display them. Of course that's still perfectly possible, but using the new APIs we can actually forego that and just use the clients and do whatever we want to do there. Basically they added two different things. They added scalable vector graphics and canvas, which serve a very similar purpose with a very different API. Scalable vector graphics is basically a vector graphic API which has a rich object model where you can set properties, attributes, manipulate existing objects, zoom in It's vector graphics, so you can zoom in, zoom out, and everything will stay crisp and sharp. The canvas, on the other hand, is a low-level painting, a bitmap painting surface. Basically, you get a square, you start painting on that. You can draw circles, fill gradients, write text, do whatever you want. But it's all pixel-based. So if you zoom in on it, it's pixelated. It doesn't scale as well as vector graphics. The other thing is there is no real object model other than the canvas itself. Basically, the canvas will give you a context. Using that context, you can start drawing, but those drawings don't create objects. They just create pixels on the screen. And if you want to change that layout, you would basically have to erase it and repaint everything. And with scalable vector graphics, because there is an object there, you could basically go in and just change the location of the object. Just to compare the two, I've got a little demo here for both. I've got a smiley face using canvas. Let's take a quick look in the browser first. So a nice canvas with a smiley face, and there is a bit of interaction. If I move my mouse over the canvas, it will actually stick to my mouse and go after it. Smiley SVG, pretty similar. SVG, smiley face, and just like the other one, it will follow my mouse and do whatever needs to be done. So how different are these? Well, smiley canvas, like I said, the markup is real simple. There's just a single canvas element, zoom in a little different, like this, with a height and a width. That's basically the blue area we draw on. And then whenever we want to do something, I've got a draw function here, and this basically draws that smiley face. It says the fill style to yellow, the stroke style, so that's basically the lines being drawn, to black. And then in this case we begin a path, start drawing arcs, filling them, moving around, drawing more, etc. Basically in the mouse move event, I say okay, remember the position where the mouse is, the X and the Y, and use request animation frame or a fallback of that, another HTML5 API for fluent drawing, and actually call that draw method. Now you can see from this code, it's not exactly obvious what it's gonna draw. I see lots of arcs and moves, and there are a few comments there about the outer circle, what the mouth and the eyes are, but other than that, it's pretty much just okay. And even for something as simple as a smiley face, this is pretty hard to tweak. I see numbers there, 50, I see an X plus 35, X minus 10, X minus 15, X plus 15, etc. I'm sure I could make this code a bit better by creating variables instead of using those minus 10 and plus 20, etc. So it might have a bit more meaning, adding some more comments, but it's not exactly easy to write or easy to change. Let's go to smiley SVG. And here you see most of the things are actually markup. I've got an SVG element, the main drawing, and I've got another SVG element in there, which is the smiley. And this actually contains pretty much the same code. The coordinates are a little different, but it draws circle, it does some translation. Basically, it's got the eye and it draws it again somewhere else. And there is a path there to draw the mouth. Still not something, especially this path, is I would want to tweak by hand, but SVG is a relatively well supported format. Sorry. Moving things around is pretty simple too. Just track the mouse move and take the smiley and change its X and Y value to wherever the mouse currently is. So tracking it is pretty easy. No need to tell it to draw again. Just because I move the X and the Y position, the shape will automatically redraw itself in that position. That's the advantage of having an actual object model there. I can just change properties instead of with this code where I basically just draw everything again. This first line in the draw, that clear rect, basically says, okay, clear the rectangle and start drawing everything again. Simple as that. So both work. Scalable vector graphics is tooling-wise a little better supported. Tools like Adobe Illustrator, which are vector graphic based, they will let you save something as a scalable vector graphics. There are not nearly as many tools around which will let you save an image as Canvas JavaScript. It turns out that Adobe Illustrator has a plugin which will actually let you convert an Adobe Illustrator painting into Canvas API code, so it will spit out this kind of code which you can just include in your application. But it won't import it, so if you tweak it, it won't be able to import that again, it's just outputting it. And with scalable vector graphics, that's actually a recognized graphical image format, so you can import it again. So when to choose which, well, I mentioned most of this. I'm not going to go through the whole list, just take a quick look. The biggest difference is one's pixel based, the other is scalable vector graphics, and one is just a low-level API, and the other gives you a rich object model. Now typically I don't care too much about either of those. Oh, actually the support is in both cases pretty good. You see that it's supported well in almost every browser. It's not supported in IE8, but there is a very similar capability in IE8 and before with another vector language, so fallback's pretty easy. Canvas is pretty much the same support. There is a difference with the Android browsers, the older Android browsers. It's also not supported on IE8 and before, but there are pretty good polyfills to take care of that. But like I said, I typically don't worry too much about it because they're low-level APIs, both. And where SVG makes tooling a little better because you can use most tools, commonly used tools by graphical designers like Adobe Illustrator. If you want to do something, using a higher level library is actually far better. And there are two I really like, and I've used quite a bit both, JQplot and Raphael. And it turns out that JQplot uses the canvas behind the scene to do its stuff, and it actually includes Explorer Canvas for older browser support. And Raphael, which is a little more generic graphics, uses the SVG style of doing things, and it actually uses VML, so that's a vector markup language which was built into IE7.8. So either will give you good fallback. Let's take a quick look at them. JQplot, assuming it shows up. It doesn't. Let's try here. JQplot. This is JQplot. Basically, it's about graphics, doing these kind of bar charts and graphs and stuff like that. And here are a bunch of examples. Some simple line charts. And here the kind of script you would write. It's basically, as you can see here, $.jqplot. It's written as a jQuery extension, like so many other things. It works really well. You can do some pretty cool things with it. Let's see. Pie donut chart. You can see mouse interaction when I move around. It highlights things. And you can actually react to it, etc. The other was Raphael. SVG should find it pretty easy. There it is. So this isn't jQuery based, but you see basically you create a drawing surface using Raphael and then you start creating things on it. So basically I created a circle which returns a circle object and you can set attributes to it. So let's take a quick look at a few demos. You see here some mouse effect. It's basically when I move my mouse, the text changes it, different text at different speeds. Or let's see here, this is a nice one, a little drawing of a couple of shapes, but you can actually pick up the shapes and draw them around, and you can see the anchor points are actually moving around as needed. So in practice, I don't really worry about the fact whether something is SVG or Canvas. I typically use higher level libraries like jQuery, Raphael, or there are others out there depending on your needs, and don't worry too much about whether they use Canvas or SVG behind the scene. If I have to use the low level API myself, I tend to prefer using SVG in most cases because the API makes it easier for tooling. Drawing on the canvas is great, but it's really hard to draw anything a little more complex. Using SVG makes that easier because you can, at least I'm not a designer, but you can get a graphical designer to create some nice vector graphics for you, and you can use those. So the last thing to look at in this presentation is storing data in the browser. Basically, there are lots of cases where we've got web applications and we need to use data which doesn't change very frequently. So something like a list of countries or a list of zip codes inside of a country or things like that. And downloading that every time is just wasteful of bandwidth. Now, traditionally, you would set HTTP caching there to a long period and hope that things would be cached either in the browser or on some intermediary hub like a proxy server or something like that. But you really can't bank on that happening. From browsers will cache things, but only for so much time. Even though you say you may cache this for a year, that doesn't mean the browser will actually cache it for a year. Especially on mobile devices where storage is limited, they tend to cache things relatively short, and that's actually where you get most benefit out of caching, because on a mobile device you're relatively likely to be on something like a 3G connection, which is slow, and round trips take a long time, so you want to do as few round trips as possible because of your application speeds. But there is also the case of expenses. You pay for the bandwidth you use, so the more bandwidth you use, the more you have to pay. The less you use, the less you have to pay. So there are lots of benefits in not requesting that same data. So there are a couple of different options we can use. Basically, there are three options, although the last one is not all that useful in real life anymore. But we've got something called local storage, which is a really simple dictionary. It stores everything locally. It's very simple to use and completely functional. But somewhat limited in the amount of space you can use there. It's advised that you can store 5 megs maximum in there, and as far as I know, most browser vendors stick to that. You can't store more, you can't request more storage, it's basically, that's what you get. You can't even check how much you've used. It's basically, okay, you've used as much as is available and you try to store some more, you will get an exception. Nothing much you can do about it. So IndexedDB is a little richer It's basically a document database inside of the browser where you can store complete JSON objects in there and retrieve them, search by key, search using indexes, etc. It's a pretty low-level API. It's pretty capable, but it's not the easiest to work with. And finally, then we've got the WebSQL, which was an Apple standard, which has been around for some years, but it's not really supported by other browsers. It was in the process of being standardized, but because of various reasons, they've actually decided not to do that, and the standard's been deprecated and will never be actually standardized. But if you're creating a web application which is purely based for Safari, suppose you do something purely for iOS, iPad, iPhone, then WebSQL is actually a viable option and you get a sort of a relational database inside the browser. But other than that, it's best to forget about its existence. So support, as you can see, local storage is supported extremely well. Pretty much every browser, with the exception of Opera Mini, supports it. IndexedDB isn't quite as good. You can see it's relatively well supported. Modern browsers, for the most part, IE 8 and 9 don't support it. And of course, all the versions of IE Safari doesn't. iOS doesn't support it, so if you're targeting iOS, maybe WebSQL is the better option. But for desktop, it's relatively well supported. So, how can you use them? Let's take a look at a little example. I've got this first example uses local storage. Let's first take a look in the browser. Basically, this tracks however often I visited this page. Every time I refresh, you see this little counter here, 2 times increase. I visited this 2 times now. And it says, welcome back stranger, because it doesn't know who I am. Using change name, update, and now if I refresh, it actually knows who I am. And if I close the browser, open it again, it will still remember that. Welcome back, Maurice, I've been here 12 times before. So what's the code required here? That's actually pretty simple. Basically, local storage, you can use it just as any JavaScript object, as a dictionary, or just use properties on it. Basically, I'm checking the hit count. First time it's undefined, so I'll actually default to 0, increase it, store it there, and then I'll just update a little element. So this little hit count element with the current hit count, and I'll do the same with the username, either stranger if it hasn't been set yet, or my name. So the thing to note here is that I can just retrieve something with a simple call like this. No need to do complex stuff. I just say local storage.hit count and I've got the value of hit count back. And I do local storage.hit count is some value and it's stored in there. I don't have to call load, I don't have to call save anything. Just use it and it will work and it will automatically be persisted. There is a little drawback to that. Suppose you're in a big loop and you're updating local storage in that loop. It will actually flush out to disk every time, so you have to be a little wary of that, especially if you start doing larger amount of storage. Suppose you're close to the 5 megabyte limit. If you're storing 5 megabyte in a tight loop for 1 million times, you will see some performance degradation. But that's not the common use case, so usually that's not much of a problem. IndexedDB is also quite easy to use. Well, let's take a look at this. Basically, I've got a little list here. I can add a name to it. So add a few names, Joe, Mark or something. Basically, you can see they're sorted, so if I add something with G, it goes to the end. If I add something with A, it goes to the top. Of course, just like before, if I close this and reopen it, the data is still there, so all the names are remembered. This does take a bit more code though. Basically, when I start up, I call OpenDB, and I call the indexdb.open, specifying a version number here. And the first time that happens, this database doesn't exist, or anytime I up this version number, it will basically say, okay, there is a version changed, so an upgrade needed event is fired. And in the upgrade needed, I basically create my schema. So in this case, I'm creating an object store to store people in, and I'm creating an index on a name. So, and I'm actually allowing duplicate values in there so I can sort things by name. If the version is still the same, upgrade needed doesn't fire, and my unsuccess fires, and I basically just track the database object being returned. Now in show people, I actually go through all the people in the database and put them inside the list. First clear the list. So the flow is basically you grab your database, start a transaction. In this case, I'm only going to read, so I'm making a read-only transaction. As part of that transaction, I grab my people object store. So that's listed as part of that transaction. That's why that's allowed. Once I've got the object store, I'll grab the index. Using the index, I open a cursor. And then whenever some data is loaded, the unsuccessful callback is fired. And it's got a result there with the value is the actual data item being stored. And you call continue in it, which asynchronously will get the next item and add that. So it's very asynchronous. It's a little tedious to work, but not too bad. It does work. However, both of these are nice, and local storage is pretty well supported, but not everywhere. It turns out there's some nice wrappers we can use. If you want to have as wide support as possible, the wrapper you want to use is LaunchAir. It basically gives you a UAPI, so it's not a polyfill, it's just a JavaScript API. But it can use local storage, it can use IndexedDB, it can use in-memory data for temporary things, it can use stuff that works on Android browsers. It's got a whole lot of different options where it can actually store data. So let's take a look at the page. The page looks just like the one I used with IndexedDB, so I can add stuff. It's not sorted here, but other than that, it will just let me use. And if I refresh the page, everything is still there. If I close it, close this and reopen it, the data is gone though. That's because I didn't add any of the persistent plugins, so it's just stored in the object. So how does it work? Basically, you include LaunchAir. With LaunchAir, you call a function which basically gives you database, and then I go through the database saying, okay, give me all the people in there and add those names to the list. Now, with LaunchAir, basically after adding LaunchAir itself, you can start adding modules there which determine how things are persisted, and you can actually put a whole list in there and it will pick the first one which applies. So I didn't add any here, that's why I actually lose the data when I close the page and reopen it. But if I added one for IndexedDB, it would work on any IndexedDB supported browser with exactly the same API. It just uses the same API, no changes there. If I add another for local storage and yet another for Android browsers, etc., I could get a whole list of supported browsers, and it would basically just pick the first one which would work on any given browser. So pretty easy to use. The drawback of Launcher is because it supports so many different storages, it's basically got a very simple API and it can't give you much more advanced stuff than that. So if you want to use something as advanced as IndexedDB but make it easier to use, the library to use is db.js. Basically, it's a wrapper around IndexedDB. So this was the IndexedDB variant where we created transactions and object stores and had to call cursor.result.continue. With db.html, the functionality is exactly the same, but basically I say OpenDB, I give the name, the version, the schema designed as an object, and if that's needed for an upgrade version, it will do it for me. If I wanted to show the list of people, that's basically, let's remove some extra white space. This is basically it. I've got the database, the people object store, query by name. So this uses the name index. Give me all records. I could filter here and say, okay, execute. And for each of those items found, execute this callback function. So the end result is exactly the same. It's a lot easier to code up and understand though. So just to show you that it does the same thing. Mark, see, same ordering as with IndexedDB, etc. It orders things automatically. So it's a very nice library. If you want to use IndexedDB, I highly recommend you use the db.js as an easier library to make IndexedDB usable. But of course it does depend on IndexedDB, so it won't run anywhere where IndexedDB itself doesn't run. Of course there are polyfills out there, so add a polyfill to make it work in an older browser. So conclusion, HTML5 has a lot of goodness. It's very, well, the pure HTML5 spec is maybe not that big, but the umbrella term HTML5 is very broad. There's a lot of stuff which is very useful today. Some requires a polyfill, some of it doesn't even require a polyfill because it's pretty much supported anywhere. Something like the time element would not require a polyfill, it will just work. Remember that some of the APIs are pretty low level, pretty hard to use. Things like Canvas. There are some pretty good libraries out there which work on top of those APIs. Use those, don't go fighting with the raw API. Take a good look out there, look at those wrapper libraries that do specific things and make life better. And remember to use sites like Can I Use and HTML5 Please to see how well supported something is, especially especially caniuse.com is excellent there. And take a look at the list of polyfills so you can actually backfill older browsers and get APIs to work that. Not every HTML5 API can be polyfilled, but almost everyone can, and almost everything is usable even if browser support isn't 100% yet. So with that, it's time for questions. The slides will go up on SlideShare tomorrow, and I'll put a link to those on my blog. The source code will go up to GitHub, and I'll put a link to on my blog for those. So they will be available tomorrow for download. I'm pretty sure Brian will send everyone attending an email with links to those as well, so it should be easy enough to get it. But while I go through the Q&A managers and check the questions, I'll leave this slide up so people can download or see my address. Let's see. Moving forward, would you recommend adding HTML5 pages to an existing site, or would you build a brand new HTML5 site? Well, in general, you can just start adding new HTML5 features to existing pages and sites. There's no need to write everything from scratch. Everything will just work. Of course, if you're starting a new site, using new HTML5 features are pretty much obvious you can do, but we'll just work on older stuff. Does all browsers have the same capacity for local storage? And I'm assuming there you're looking at the amount of space you've got to save data. The 5 megabytes is actually a recommended part of the specifications. It's not mandatory, so it's perfectly possible there are browsers out there which will give you less space. For example, somewhere where I would expect that is on mobile devices where space is relatively limited. That said, all the browsers I'm aware of have stuck to that 5 megabyte limit, so you've got 5 megabytes of storage. I prefer not to get close to it though, because like I said, you can't check how much you're using, and it's basically on a per domain. So you're using up the space for a whole domain, so if different parts of an application use space, it's added up to that 5 megabyte limit, and getting close to it will just cause problems. Can you actually emulate touch events in Chrome under setting overrides and check emulate touch events? Not sure how well this works. To be honest, I'm not sure how well that works either. I've got Chrome installed on my iPad and things work relatively well there. Pretty much everything that works on Safari works on Chrome there as well. So not really seeing a lot of issues, just a few. And the only thing I can think of was graphics related, not touch related. So, well, yeah, I guess that's as much as I can say about it. So with local storage, how do you avoid conflict with name keys used by other browser applications? Can you add a namespace, local storage, .myapp, .modulename, .hitCount? Yes, you can certainly do so. You can put whatever you want to it as long as it's serializable as a string. I think I actually forgot to mention this, but everything you store inside of local storage has to be a string. So your syntax would have to be somewhat different. Like, let me go back to the browser for a moment and do this in the console. Local storage, you would probably use syntax like this. So my app.ns.hitCount or something like that. Oops, that should be a square bracket. Something like that. Double quotes help. So that way it's namespaced to say my app.ns. Let's get back to the Q&A manager. Where was it? There. Of course, these have to be serializable. I just put a number on here and that works, but if I go back to the browser and I suppose I want to put an object in here, let's do a new date. And I retrieve this. You see, I actually get a string back. So everything it is basically called toString on it and stored that way. With a number, toString works fine. With a new date, it works relatively fine. It's something you can parse again. But with the richer objects, if I said is a one, for instance, its toString is object, so that's not really useful in that case. The thing is to do JSON.stringify. Now, it's still a string in there, but it's parsable, and I could use JSON.parse to get it back into an object. There's the Q&A manager. It was suggested you can emulate touch events on a desktop computer with a mouse. That's a question about Chrome. Yes, that's perfectly possible. I'm still not sure how well it works. Typically, I don't do this myself. I'll use my iPad or my Windows 8 machine and test things over there. So I've got real touch. I don't really do that. I do quite a lot of my developments on my laptop anyway, so I can just touch the screen. It's got a fully capable touch screen, so it works just fine. We've had this question. Thank you. So basically, I'm getting complimented. It was a good session. Well, thank you. So I think I've answered all these questions. So unless there are any more questions, feel free to add them. Let's mark these off. Yes. So, unless there are any other questions, I would like to thank everyone for attending. Check my blog and the email from the LinkedIn.net users group tomorrow for the slides and all the source code. And thanks for attending.
Well, thank you very much, Maurice. I think it's easy to say that was yet another successful presentation. I've had a ton of questions and requests for both the code, when does recording go up, and are you going to come back again? And the easy answer is yes, you are coming back, and yes, the code will be available, and yes, if you have registered with our Eventbrite session, you will receive an email with the links to the demos and the code. Again, thank you very much, everybody. Remember, you can definitely find this recording here, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours at tops, on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/LIDNUG. Any questions you need, please feel free to fire them through to info@lidnug.org. And again, thank you very much for attending a LIDNUG and DevelopMentor session.